You're watching TVC Breakfast. Now, many Nigerians are expressing their concern over the country's rising debt profile as the federal government revealed its plan to fund the 2023 budget through additional loans. Earlier in the week, Minister of Finance and National Planning, Zainab Ahmed, told members of the House of Representatives Committee on Finance that the federal government will borrow over 11 trillion naira and sell national assets to finance the budget deficit in 2023. The minister also said that the 19.76 trillion naira has been proposed by the federal government as budgetary expenditures for the 2023 fiscal year, and the budget may hit a fiscal deficit of between 11.3 trillion and 12.41 trillion naira, depending on the removal timeline of the subsidy regime. This is the crux of our next discussion. Joining us now to discuss the implication of this on the Nigerian economy and much more is the CEO, Center for Promotion of Private Enterprise, and an economist, and the immediate past Director General of the Lagos Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Dr. Muda Yusuf. Dr. Yusuf, good morning. It's good to have you join us on TVC Breakfast.
Good morning.
Great.
My pleasure to be with you there.
All right. Now, talk to us basically the debt profile or the debt crisis, as some people will put it, that Nigeria has been facing seem to be getting worse. And one would expect that knowing where we stand or where we stood, the government would have come up with strategies to avert all of this and retract the trend. But it seems we're getting deeper and deeper, and even the plan and projection for next year, it seems the loan is the only way to go.
Yes, it's a very worrisome situation. The outlook is not looking good at all. And these things have far-reaching implications. Of course, the government also is faced with a number of challenges, some of which, if we had the political will, we could deal with. Some of which may be perhaps beyond the control of the government. As we speak, as at March, I think the public debt was about 41 trillion. And if that's 41 trillion naira, if we add the component of debt that is owed to the CBN, which is often not computed as part of the public debt, but it's sovereign debt nonetheless, because it's a debt that has to be repaid. That component is already getting close to 20 trillion. By the time you add that to the 41 trillion, you are getting almost 61 trillion. Now you have debt that is also owned by AMCON. That's also well over 5 trillion. So really, already, the situation is extremely very bad as far as the debt situation is concerned. And going by the report that we got from the minister when she was given the report of the first 4 months, fiscal report of the first 4 months of this year, we already had a situation where the revenue was just about 1.6 trillion, actual revenue, that is. And the debt service payment was 1.94. So the debt service payment was already 119% of the revenue. So the debt service is already ahead of revenue. And even more disturbing is the fact that on practically all the revenue items, there were very large negative variances in terms of the revenue performance. In most cases, the revenue variances were well over 40%. In some cases, even getting close to 60% negative variances, I must say. So even the budget, the one that has been presented, is on the assumption that we'll have 100% performance in revenue, which is not likely to be. So if you have a shortfall, if the revenue performance is, for instance, maybe around 70% or 60%, the deficit will be far more than this. The deficit is far, far more than, in fact, we may be talking about 15 to 17 trillion deficit. So it's a very serious situation. And when the MTF was presented as a medium-term expenditure framework, there were two scenarios that were presented by the finance minister. There was the first scenario, which is the scenario that the subsidy will have to exist for the whole year, that's January to December 2023. And under that scenario, the deficit will be 12.4 trillion. The second scenario is if the deficit ends by June next year, which is what was promised by government, we'll be having a deficit of 11.3 trillion. And in all cases, of course, this is far in excess of what is allowed in the Fiscal Responsibility Act. Although if the National Assembly approves, there could be a waiver on that. So on the whole, it's a very dire situation. And I see a situation where the incoming administration will have to grapple with a whole lot of fiscal issues around the management of the economy.
Right.
Because this deficit is going to get worse than what is being presented.
Right. Now, you spoke about the issue of subsidy, which has been a subject of controversy over time. And you would agree with me that governments come, go, and haven't really succeeded with the removal of subsidy. I wonder what dire situation we have found ourselves now. Is the removal the way to go? Will it solve the challenge that we are faced with? Or what do we do as we speak?
Well, you know, when you have a financial problem or a fiscal crisis in this case, there are two ways of dealing with it. And the two ways are not mutually exclusive. In other words, they have to exist together. A financial problem will arise either as a result of a revenue challenge. It could also arise as a result of huge expenditure. So if we must deal with a situation like this, we have to look at both sides. Look at what we can do about revenue, which the government is already trying to do. A lot of engagement with the revenue generating agencies, looking at the problem of oil theft and all of that. Then we also need to look at the expenditure side, which the government is not doing much about. Because from all indications, the government is looking as if it is helpless about cutting revenue. Because in all of this, even with the serious revenue challenge, expenditure has been growing, unfortunately. There is no deliberate, we haven't seen any serious effort to cut down on expenditure. The only conversation we have had was around this Oronsaye report on how to merge ministries and cut down on the workforce and all of that. But that has not happened. Oronsaye report has been submitted close to 3 or 4 years now. So we have been dancing around it. For some reason, the government has not been able to muster the political will to take any serious action. And I doubt whether any serious action will be taken before the end of this administration. So there isn't much that is happening on the expenditure side. On the revenue side, well, the government have been trying to do some things, but again, no much results. Because if we look at the performance that was given, revenue performance in the first 4 months of this year, there were negative variances under oil revenue because of all the challenges of oil theft, oil vandalization of oil facilities, the exit of investors in the upstream and all of that. a negative variance of almost over 50%. The same thing with non-oil revenue. There were negative variances in all of them. So it is a major dilemma. But the subsidy thing is one big elephant in the room. And we have to deal with it because we cannot have a situation where we'll be spending on deficits an amount that is higher than even the revenue that we are all getting. Because if we continue this way, if you take the first scenario where the subsidy will not be removed for the whole year, we are talking about spending about 6.7 trillion on fuel subsidy. If we stay by the second scenario that the subsidy will terminate in June 2023, we are talking about 3.6 trillion or 3.3 trillion. So either way, it is still a very heavy burden. So we can't run away from dealing with this issue of subsidy. I agree the shock of removing subsidy will be extremely too hard on the citizens at this time. But we can have a model of gradual exit from it. Because we need to be realistic, and we need to be very pragmatic, and we need to do things that are sustainable, so that we don't have a situation where the entire system will crash on everybody.
So what timeline?
So there's no running away from it.
What timeline?
Then there are other issues around expenditure, around revenue leakages, around even reforming the budget itself. That also needs to happen, because even in all of this, there are also all sorts of issues around revenue leakages. Around leakages in government. Look at what is happening with the Accountant General of the Federation. Look at the humongous amount that is involved. Even though it's still an allegation, but if the man is now talking about plea bargain, that's an indication that actually this thing happened. And you can have that also in many of the other agencies of government.
Dr. Muda Yusuf,
so we need to tackle all those things.
We've been speaking in the last couple of minutes with an economist and a former Director General of the Lagos Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Dr. Muda Yusuf. It's good to have you still with us. You were talking earlier about the sustainability of the fuel subsidy regime. And I wanted to ask then what you think, what your preferred timeline would be on ending the the fuel subsidy regime, because just as you've said that, maintaining it also comes with costs, taking it away also comes with costs as well.
Well, there has to be an urgent engagement with all the critical stakeholders, and there has to be a phased removal of it. We cannot remove it in one fell swoop. And what is playing out now is, I think, the administration wants to push all these issues up until maybe May 29 and hand over all these challenges to the next administration. But I'm not sure we can even get to that point with this heavy burden of having to finance the deficit. So there has to be an engagement, and we see how we can gradually exit from it. If between now and the end of next year, at least we're able to get maybe 50% of it out, that will help the financial situation, because what is happening now, and the minister also hinted about that we may not even have any provision for capital expenditure at all in any of the MDAs, apart from the expenditure that is funded by all these World Bank and multilateral agencies. In terms of provision, if you go hog with this subsidy, there will be no expenditure for capital projects. That means there will be no investment in infrastructure, whether it is social or economic, roads, hospitals, and all, in terms of capital expenditure. And we cannot run an economy that way. So we can't run away from it. Then we need to deal with all these issues of oil theft, because that is also a revenue, part of the major leakages of revenue. I mean, how do we have a situation where, according to the NFDC chief executive, we are losing almost $2 billion on a monthly basis? That again is not sustainable. I mean, how can it happen that we have a country with all the security agencies, with a whole command of the Navy in the Niger Delta area, with all the paraphernalia of people who are supposed to monitor all of these things, with all the bureaucracy, and yet people are able to make away with that much of our crude oil loaded in vessels. They're not loading it in small boats. They are loading it in super tankers. So that is a major failure also of governance. So the government needs to step up in terms of the surveillance in the oil and in the oil producing area to put an end to that. If we're able to do that, that will help.
All right.
Then we have the issue of our refineries. Because this subsidy is becoming such a big issue because our refineries are not working. Because we are not refining products domestically. And refining petroleum products is not rocket science. So people begin to wonder, what is the big deal about getting refineries to work? What is the big deal about attracting private investors to set up refinery? It is a very profitable business. People are willing to put their money in if the policy environment is okay. So government should take that also much more seriously. We have some private initiatives already. We have the Dangote refinery and a few other private modular refineries that are coming up. And then we have this initiative of the government itself to rehabilitate its own refineries. Let us accelerate that. If you're able to do that, be able to deal much more easily with all these subsidy problems if you are refining domestically. The problem is this much because we are importing 100% of our petroleum product needs.
All right, Dr. Yusuf.
PMS, diesel, aviation fuel, and so on.
Yeah, Dr. Yusuf, let me ask you this. I was going to take you to the Dangote refinery, but since you've mentioned it, let me stand on that. Now, what scenario could be created, or what scenarios can we have? Because a lot of assumptions are out there that the Dangote refinery coming upstream will end all of these issues of subsidy payment and all of that. Create a scenario for us from your understanding what that is going to be like if that is the way to go.
Well, that is not the only way to go. Of course, government also has its own refinery. We have 4 of them. And from what we are told, contracts have been awarded. And we expect that by mid next year, these refineries will be up and running. But having said that, the fact that you have the private refineries is not a guarantee that the subsidy will disappear completely. Certainly not. The only difference it will make is that first, we can have an engagement with the Dangote himself, the owners of the refineries. Because we produce the crude here, we can give concessionary terms in terms of crude sales to that refinery and get back concessionary refined petroleum products. Because Dangote refinery is not a government refinery. Dangote refinery is a private company. Dangote refinery is in the free trade zone. So taking product there is also like importing from other countries. But the advantage it presents, first, is the advantage of transportation cost, or what you call the freight cost. Because it's in our territory, you don't have to incur very huge transportation costs bringing product from Belgium and from all these other countries to Nigeria. So there's a savings on that. Secondly, because it's also on our soil, we can have an engagement and sell crude at a concessionary rate so that we can get concessionary products at concessionary prices from Dangote refinery. Otherwise, because the refinery is in a free trade zone, it can decide, the company can decide to just be exporting all its products. So that's the whole concept of being in a free trade zone. But if you want to buy the products, and we don't want the product to be sold to us at an international price, you should be ready to give crude at a price that is also not international price of crude. That is the model that can work and that can be sustainable. Because Dangote has its shareholders, it has its own financial obligations, it has its own, there are also debts financing, there are equity financing in that project. All of these stakeholders have invested because they see it as a business. So that is what can happen. So that may not completely remove the subsidy, but it will reduce it at least significantly if we are able to, adopt this kind of arrangements. That is what can happen.
Right. Now, there are those still talking about refineries who say that perhaps the government can look at converting those illegal refineries to modular refineries. And with regards to oil theft, there are also talks about government, naming those who are involved in this to really address the matter of oil theft.
Illegal refineries, the whole concept of illegal refineries is not the same thing as modular refineries. They are different things completely. A proper modular refinery, for you to set it up, you'll be talking of a couple of millions of dollars. Maybe $1 million, maybe $2 million, maybe $3 million, or even $10 million. So it's not as simple as maybe setting up a rice mill or a cassava machine. Certainly not. That is one. Those illegal refineries are operating with stolen crude. So their cost of crude is zero. That cannot be a business model. That cannot be an alternative. When you go and bust pipelines and steal the crude and use it to now produce, that is not a model that you can be discussing. It's not the same thing. If you have a proper modular refinery, you have to buy crude at the cost of the true price of the crude from the oil producing companies, because it costs them a lot of money to be able to exploit this crude from the deposit level, either under the sea or under the ground. This is cost money. So if you have the legal refineries and you ask them to come and pay $70 per barrel or $100 per barrel, can they pay it? Of course not. They're able to try because they are using crude that is stolen. So the cost of crude to them is zero. That is not a model that you can be discussing. That is pure illegality. And if you put them in the legal frame and ask them to buy the crude at the proper price, their business cannot thrive. So that is the situation with that. Then in terms of the oil theft, I think that's your second question.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
That's about the commitment of the government to name it. Of course, the government should name them. But from the scale of that theft, you can see that there's a whole lot of conspiracy around it. That magnitude of theft cannot take place if you don't have powerful forces involved in it across all the segments of government. And that much was said by the NNPC chief executive. There are a whole lot of interest. And I imagine that there must be powerful interest for it to be taking such a long time, not only to name them, to actually prosecute them. So we also need the political will. If there are barriers on that, the government should have the political will to remove those barriers. You cannot have a situation where a whole tanker, a whole vessel will be moving crude, I mean, there are a whole lot of processes that you need to go through before you can load, before you can come into our shores, before you can leave our shores. People have to be held to account. So we need to demand accountability for all those in that chain, in that export chain of crude oil, the supply chain, the transportation chain, everything. There has to be some rigorous interrogation.
All right, Dr.
And if you
Yusuf,
are really committed to it, I'm sure it's something that can be done.
Dr. Yusuf, let's also quickly talk about some assessment of Nigeria's rising debt profile. Some have said, since you've talked about legalities now and where the law is amidst all these, controversies, the Fiscal Responsibility Act amidst Nigeria's debt profile, there are sentiments that Nigeria has even exceeded the threshold, recorded or stipulated in this law. Do you also agree? And where do we go from here?
Well, the debt profile is extremely very, very disturbing, because the government has projected a revenue of about 8.4 trillion. And if you take a subsidy, that's if you have the subsidy for the whole year, for about 6.7 trillion, then you have a debt service of about another 6.1 trillion. Already, for a year, you already have an expenditure outlay of in excess of 12 trillion naira. We have not talked about the personnel cost. We have not talked about the overhead cost. We have not talked about the capital project or capital expenditure. So you can see how bad the situation is. And the revenue projection is 8.4. So even before you even begin to do begin to embark on critical expenditures of government, the revenue has been exhausted at the level of subsidy and debt service. That is a major issue. So the debt itself, from what I've said, of course, it's not sustainable, and should be looking at how to also even manage it more sustainably. If you need to begin to engage with our creditors about it, we should begin to do so. Because at least we recently had the announcement from China that they want to write off some debts for some African countries. Nigeria is unfortunately not on the list. There can be an engagement around the fact that, okay, can we reconsider this debt? Can we get some debt restructuring or debt forgiveness or whatever? That is a conversation that we can begin to have. Then we need to also look at the portfolio of the debt. We need to tone down, because this deficit still has to be financed from borrowing. And if you must borrow, we have to worry about the cost at which we are borrowing. That is also important.
All right.
As much as possible, we should reduce our exposure to commercial debt. I'm talking of international foreign debt now. We should be focusing more on multilateral and concessionary debts, because the commercial debts are very expensive, and they account for almost 40% of our foreign debts.
Yeah, Dr. Yusuf, in the talk about debt cancellation or debt forgiveness, does Nigeria qualify for a debt forgiveness at this time? Recall that in the early 2000s, much of our debts were forgiven and cancelled. It didn't take long before we accumulated and even went beyond the threshold and even went far beyond where we were in the early 2000s. As it is right now, does Nigeria qualify for a debt forgiveness or cancellation?
We qualify if you can make our case. I mean, look at the macroeconomic challenges. If you have a situation where your debt service is already exceeding your revenue, I mean, it's a good basis to argue that, well, these debts are becoming too much, I can't cope with it. I mean, we qualify. If you can make a case, why not? Because if you find yourself in a financial crisis, whatever concession you can get, whatever window of concession you can get, you should try to get it so that you get some relief. So there's nothing wrong in trying to negotiate some of these debts, either in terms of forgiveness or in terms of restructuring or whatever. It's something that you can have engagement about. But for commercial component of the debt, it's not easy to get any concession because that is purely commercial debt. You have floated a bond, people are subscribed to it, you can't go back and be telling stories. That cannot fly. The only area in which you can have some engagement or concession is on these bilateral debts or multilateral debts. That debts owed to between country to country, like the debt we owe to China, owe to some European countries, or bilateral debts with World Bank, ADB, and those are the areas where you can be having some serious discussion. But in terms of commercial debt, there's very little you can do. Then there's also the domestic component of the debt. That again, there's very little because, I mean, you have floated a federal government bond, people are subscribed, you can't go back and be negotiating that. So, to say whether we can qualify, of course, we can make a case. Why not? Because it's a very as difficult situation that we have found ourselves in. But of course, there's also a whole lot that we should do internally, just as I said, to look to cut on expenditure, because even if you are speaking to anybody about debt cancellation and they are hearing that your accountant general is being alleged to have done away with almost 100 billion or something, how will they take us seriously? They are hearing about stories about our oil theft. How will they take us seriously? So there are things that we need to fix internally. And in all of this, there are also implications for the economy. There are implications for investors. There are implications for the citizens.
Perhaps you could shed light on that for us.
Yes, of course. These things have serious macroeconomic implications. Because the more you have this kind of crisis where your revenue cannot cover your subsidy and your debt service, the more you borrow. And that's a vicious cycle. The more you call on the CBN, which already has also exceeded its threshold in terms of supporting government, as provided for in the CBN Act, the more we call on the CBN to continue to put money in the economy. So it has macroeconomic implications when your deficit is getting completely out of hand. It has implications for increase in money supply. It has implications for inflation. Already the inflationary situation is bad enough. But it may get worse, unfortunately, with this trajectory. It has implications for exchange rate depreciation. The currency is already extremely weak because of all these problems. I mean, all of us know what is happening to the naira-dollar exchange rates. With this trajectory, with this increasing deficit, increasing monetization or CBN financing of deficit, the exchange rate depreciation may get worse than what it is right now, which is also not a good thing. You know, and all of these things have implications for the welfare of the people. It has implications for production costs. It has implications for, you know, all the challenges that businesses are facing. So if we are not careful, this situation may continue to get worse. So we need to be looking at how we can mitigate this so that the pains on the people, on the citizens, will not be too much, because we cannot afford to continue to grapple with this high inflationary situation, high cases of high deficit, exchange rate depreciation, depletion of our reserves, and so on. Those things are not good at all. And they're also like creating a whole lot of reputational implication for the economy. Look at what is happening to the airlines.
Right.
The airlines are also suspending flights to Nigeria because we cannot meet their foreign exchange demands. Those things are not good for the image of the country.
And like
how do you attract investors?
Like we've seen, Dr. Yusuf, this vicious cycle that you've also noted, it doesn't appear that the non-oil sector is immune to this, like the weak exchange rate, how things appear to be very, very unpredictable with our exchange rate and you know, all these other factors. What would have been like a ready buffer, so to speak, with the non-oil sector? It doesn't appear to work. Or is there a way we can, you know, still fall on the kind of comfort or so from the non-oil sector? Because people have said, why are we not even getting as much gains from the non-oil sector despite the investment up till now?
Well, even the little revenue we are getting it from non-oil sector. I mean, company tax, VAT, and all of that. The report that the minister presented covering January to April, the non-oil sector performance was 84%. The oil sector performance was 49% of target. The customs revenue was just 25% of target as at April. So the non-oil sector, I mean, the government is extracting as much as it can. And with this trajectory, I see the government agencies harassing even more investors, a lot more, which is also not a good outlook for businesses, because everybody is now shouting about revenue mobilization. Even government agencies that are not supposed to be chasing revenue have abandoned their core functions and they are now chasing revenue. Many of them are now harassing businesses up and down, particularly businesses that are already in the tax net.
All right.
That is also not good for our investment environment.
Yeah, we have to leave it here now. Dr. Muda Yusuf, the CEO Center for Promotion of Private Enterprise. We thank you so much for the enlightenment and your insight into all of these issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My
Thank you,
pleasure.
Dr.
Thank you.
Right.